So how do we get here? Let's discuss with the author of The Diversity Delusion, Heather McDonald, and former New York City Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik. Good to have both of you with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I want to start with something the Reverend Al Sharpton said today during funeral services for George Floyd.
Until the law is upheld and people know they will go to jail, they're going to keep doing it because they're protected by wickedness in high places.
Heather, I know you dig into the stats on these various cases. The data that is unbiased, these are simply numbers, but what can you tell us about Reverend Sharpton's claim that people are getting away with things and that bad officers know they're not going to have to pay a price?
Well, there are some departments that have very strong unions, but in general, the narrative that is being promulgated here, Shannon, is completely false and it is dangerous. The idea that policing is systemically racist simply does not stand up to scrutiny. Last year, there were about 10 so-called unarmed black males who were killed by the police. That's defining unarmed very liberally. Out of 7,500 blacks who were killed in criminal homicide, overwhelmingly by other blacks. There's obviously bad cops out there of all races, but the fact of the matter is the reason cops are in minority neighborhoods is because that's where people are being victimized at 10 to 13 times the rate of the rest of the population. And that's where people are begging for police protection. The senior citizens are desperate for more police. They view them as their protectors, as their friends. This narrative is going to cause police to back off further, and it's going to be black lives who are lost in the droves.
Well, Commissioner, let me ask you, because the other night we saw on another network that a Minneapolis state or county city official there said essentially that calling 911 reveals privilege, that people who are white in a good neighborhood calling for help feel like they're going to have a positive interaction with police. But she said you have to remember a lot of minority communities, for them calling 911 is not the same thing. What's your reaction to her statement?
It's a lie. It's an outright lie. And all you have to do is look at the statistics in New York City from 1994 to 2002, when the greatest benefactors to crime reduction, whether it was a 70% reduction in violent crime or an 80% reduction in homicide, the biggest benefactors were the black communities who were calling police for robberies, assaults, murders, you name it. The police responded. They didn't go there based on somebody's color. They went there because they were called as the result of a crime. That's the reality. That's real stuff. And the greatest benefactors of those substantial reductions were basically blacks and people of color in New York City.
Okay, I want to read something from National Review that talked about protesting works, rioting doesn't, and they separate those are two very different things. But they talked about the rioters who are being applauded in a lot of cases. They say when you tell people their violence is righteous, you engage in what's called moral licensing. People start to think not only does what I'm doing feel good, but it's even improving the world around me, even as it demonstrably does the opposite. I mean, Heather, we have a lot of mixed messages going on right now.
I wish they were more mixed, Shannon. I'm not seeing any mixed. I'm seeing an absolute unanimous chorus practically on the part of politicians celebrating this. Not only are they giving it moral justification, but the mere fact that people are really not being arrested, they're not being punished, there's no deterrent value. We have now sent the message that the rule of law in this country means nothing, that you can get away with destroying people's property, livelihoods, shooting at officers, running over officers, slashing their throats. It's beyond belief. We are allowing the worst, basest instincts of human nature to take over our cities, and we are going to put ourselves back into a situation of barbarism. Cities are not possible when people fear going out at night. And again, as Commissioner Kerik says, the people who benefit the most from proactive, lawful policing, which is what the vast majority of policing is in this country, are those vulnerable minority citizens who beg for the dealers to get off the streets, for the kids hanging out, smoking weed, selling drugs, to be cleared away because they want to be able to feel just as safe, and they have a right to feel just as safe as people in wealthier neighborhoods.
And Commissioner, what about these NYPD officers we're hearing from who say the mayor is essentially throwing them under the bus? They're going out to face hostile crowds. They have a very difficult job to do, and they seem very rightly upset that they're being thrown in the same bunch as people who are officers who may have committed criminal acts and are now charged with murder and other things. We know that's not the vast majority of officers, but they feel abandoned by anybody having their back at this point.
Well, they don't have anybody in their back, especially in New York State. You have the mayor, the governor, and the New York State Attorney General all have villainized the cops. And I think what the cops feel most, Shannon, is there's this perception out there and this driving force by the protesters and critics, legislators, there's systematic abuses by police, when in fact the cops know that the real there's one systematic issue in this country that nobody's focused on, and that's the slaughter of black men and women and communities of color, be it Chicago, be it St. Louis, Brooklyn, Baltimore, at numbers that are inconceivable, and nobody's paying any attention to it. You want to talk about systematic? Those things are systematic.
Well, we do have to care about all of those cases, and you point out a number of cities that need a lot of attention as well. Heather McDonald, Bernie Kerik, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon.